Hi, my name is Alda, and when I think about how strangely and unexpectedly joy and sorrow intertwine in life, I remember this particular period of time when I was 33 years old and worked as an interior designer in a large company, where the salary allowed me to feel confident, and where each project brought not only income, but also the pleasure of being able to create a space for other people, giving it comfort and character. But oddly enough, this story is not about my career at all, although it has always occupied a significant place in my life, but about a decision that seemed to me the most important in my adult life, and which, as it turned out, had devastating consequences for my family. About 6 months ago, I decided to buy a house. It wasn't just a house, but a wreck, a place that by all indications was unfit for habitation. Photos of the property looked as if hope itself had been drained from it. Peeling paint covered the walls. The yard, neglected for years, had turned into a wild jungle, reminiscent of a tropical jungle. Every corner seemed to whisper a warning of an endless money pit into which all my energy and savings would disappear. But looking at it, I saw not horror, but opportunity, a space for change and a new meaning for myself. I was especially captivated by the backyard. I'd spent my entire adult life in apartments with limited square footage and noisy neighbors next door, and the thought of now having my own private outdoor space where I could plant flowers, place a chair, listen to the silence, and do whatever I wanted filled me with delight. The price, considering the house's condition, was so low that I decided to take out a mortgage without any hesitation. But my decision was met with incomprehension and even ridicule from my family. After listening to me over Sunday dinner, my mother immediately exclaimed, "Alda, what are you thinking? Why do you need this wreck when you can buy a nice apartment where everything is ready?" Her voice was a mixture of alarm and irritation, while my father merely shook his head, saying that this house would drain me of all my energy, money, and time. Even my younger brother, Gaston, usually more reserved, couldn't resist adding that it would be much easier for him to buy an apartment and not have to worry about it, since buying such a place was a real nightmare. As always, his wife, Sarah, was also at the table. She rarely spoke, but her tendency to roll her eyes whenever I mentioned plans irritated me more than any words. She was one of those women who pretend to know better than anyone, but never actually put in the work, spending all their time on dubious attempts to become an influencer on social media. And although her silent judgment stung, at that moment, I was determined and wasn't going to let other people's opinions deter me. I bought the house, signed all the papers, received the keys, and standing in the empty living room with peeling walls and the smell of damp, I suddenly felt like I was on the threshold of a new life. And the surge of excitement and happiness was incomparable. The 6 months of renovation were the most grueling and expensive of my life. I painted, decorated, and tidied up the garden. I entrusted the major projects to the crews I worked with at work, and they, knowing me, gave me a huge discount, charging almost half the usual price, saving me thousands. It was like living in a Home Depot. I spent every weekend among cans of paint, flooring samples, and plumbing fixtures I'd never even imagined. There were nights when I cried from exhaustion and wondered if I was even in my right mind, especially when it turned out the electrical system needed replacing completely, or when it rained for 3 days straight and I discovered a leaky roof. But little by little, week after week, the house was transformed. The walls sparkled with fresh paint, the floors gleamed, the new kitchen was filled with light, and the former jungle of the yard was transformed into a green haven of peace. It was then that I felt the urge to invite everyone to a housewarming party, to show my family that all the hard work and dedication I'd put into this house had been worth it. Over dinner at my parents', I announced that I was expecting everyone over the following Saturday and added that I'd be especially pleased if they could see the house after the renovation. At that moment, Sarah suddenly laughed loudly and unpleasantly. Her laughter sounded almost mocking, and she, without even hiding her contempt, said, "I don't want to go to this pigsty." I was shocked, because no polite person would say such a thing, so I gathered my courage and said calmly, "Actually, I've done a major renovation, and if you don't want to, don't come." Sarah immediately blushed, fell silent, and sat there the entire evening looking gloomy, like a small child resentful of the world, while my parents and Gaston, although they had promised to come, looked as if they were making this promise with great reluctance. The party began on Saturday at exactly 6 o'clock, and I, nervous as a schoolgirl on her first date, had set the table in advance, arranged the glasses, lit the candles, and even prepared a few appetizers myself, although I usually preferred to entrust such things to restaurants. My colleagues, neighbors, and friends arrived on time, and immediately the house filled with the hubbub of voices, laughter, and the clink of dishes. I caught the glances of people moving from room to room, touching the furniture, examining the details, and over again telling me how wonderful everything looked. They asked me about the materials, the colors, how certain design decisions came about, and they were lavish with praise that made my heart flutter. Finally, I could share the fruits of my labor with those who could appreciate it. The party was going well, but amid all the merriment there was one unpleasant blemish. My family was missing. An hour passed, then another half hour, and I was beginning to think they weren't planning on coming at all, that their promise had been just for show, when suddenly I heard the sound of cars pulling up, and looking out the window saw familiar silhouettes. My parents, Gaston and Sarah, emerged and headed for the door, their expressions clearly suggesting they were bracing themselves for a catastrophe, as if they were about to enter the ruins of an earthquake rather than the house I'd spent 6 months building. But as soon as they stepped through the door, their expressions changed. My mother froze, her eyes wide, and quietly said, "Oh my God, Alda, this is simply magnificent. You have amazing taste." In that moment, I felt a sense of relief, as if my entire struggle for this house had finally made sense, and I wished I could freeze that moment forever. But as soon as I glanced at Sarah, my heart sank again. She wasn't delighted, she wasn't smiling, but walked around with the air of a stern inspector, peering into corners, running her finger over surfaces, squinting critically at the walls, as if searching for even the slightest flaw to devalue my work. She didn't appear for a while, having gone upstairs, and I half hoped she'd simply remained there in silence. But when she returned, she declared loudly so everyone could hear, "The color in your bedroom is terrible. I'd change it." I felt a wave of anger rise in my chest, but I controlled myself, smiled, and said, "Well, when you have your own house, you can paint the walls pink." I emphasized the word, as everyone knew of her strange obsession with pink, and the effect was stunning. Her face flushed, and it seemed she was about to explode with anger. "Come on, Gaston. We're leaving," she snapped, turning toward the door. My brother looked at me with an apologetic smile but followed his wife, and my parents, embarrassed and disappointed, soon left as well, shaking their heads, as if in their eyes I was still a child who had done something stupid. The party continued without them, and frankly, it was better that way. My friends and colleagues filled the house with the warmth and joy I'd wanted to instill there. But after the whole housewarming disaster, I decided my family needed time to calm down and wasn't about to force a reconciliation. However, a week later, my mother unexpectedly called and asked if she could come again, this time alone. There was such gentleness and even a hint of guilt in her voice that I immediately agreed. "I feel terrible about how everything ended," she said, "and I'd like to see your house in peace without all the drama." She came over the weekend and it was touching and sweet. She walked slowly through the rooms, lingering in each one, listening attentively as I explained why I'd chosen a particular color, or this particular furniture, or the particular window treatments. She sincerely praised my work, and then we drank coffee together in my new kitchen, and she admitted how proud she was of me and my accomplishments. "Your father and I were wrong to talk you out of this purchase," she said. "You knew what you were doing." I treasured those words in my heart, because I'd longed to hear them. When my mother was about to leave, I decided to do something I'd been thinking about for a long time. I handed her the spare key and said, "If I ever leave, maybe you could water the plants or just check that everything is okay." She hugged me tightly, and it felt like the closeness we'd lost was returning between us. In the following months, Mom did indeed come over a few times, sometimes with groceries, sometimes just to have tea with me or cook dinner together, and it was pleasant, like a return to something proper and reliable. With Gaston and Sarah, things were different. My brother only sent occasional short messages, never mentioning home, and Sarah seemed to disappear, and I confess, I was happy with that. My father straddled the line. He didn't deliberately distance himself, but he didn't strive to visit me more often either, so I decided not to pressure him. 4 months passed, and I gradually returned to my usual rhythm. Work was going well. I loved my home, enjoyed my space, and even started a light-hearted affair, one that didn't require seriousness but brought me lightness and smiles. Everything seemed calm and smooth until one Thursday evening when Mom called. Her voice was unusually cautious, as if she were choosing every word, and I became wary. "Alda, dear, would you like to come over for dinner this Saturday? It's been so long. We haven't had the whole family together," she said. Something in her tone made me wary, but I agreed anyway, because I missed our family dinners and hoped that perhaps time had really smoothed things over and everyone would be able to behave normally again. Saturday arrived and I went to my parents' house, trying not to overthink things, though there was still a nagging unease in my chest that I couldn't shake. When I walked into the house, I immediately noticed that Gaston and Sarah were already there, which of course didn't surprise me, since they practically lived with my parents on the weekends, as if they'd forgotten they had their own apartment. "Hi, little sister," Gaston said in an overly friendly tone, and his cloying friendliness immediately put me on guard. Sarah barely glanced in my direction, but although her eyes were cold, they lacked the usual fierce condemnation, and even that felt strangely relieving. We sat down at the table, and Mom placed her signature stew in front of us, a dish I'd always loved since childhood because it reminded me of simple family evenings when everything seemed stable and reliable. The conversation was a little stiff at first. Everyone politely exchanged small talk about work, the weather, and other trivial matters, but there was a tense air, as if everyone was waiting for something important to be said. I was just telling a story about a difficult client when Mom suddenly carefully placed her fork on the table and, looking at me with a gentle gaze, gave me a tender smile. "Alda, my dear, I wanted to talk to you about something," she said in the same tone she'd used on the phone a few days earlier. Everyone immediately fell silent, the fork stopped clinking, and all eyes turned to me. Gaston smiled his old childish smile, the same one he'd used to approach me with as a child when he wanted something and knew my sister wouldn't resist. "He and Sarah's lease is up soon," Mom continued, "and with the economic situation and Gaston's work difficulties, it's becoming increasingly difficult for them to find a place they can afford." At that moment, I felt my stomach clench, knowing full well where this speech would lead. "We were thinking," Mom said, trying to speak especially gently, "that maybe they could stay with you for a while, just temporarily, until they get back on their feet." A silence fell over the room, so thick and cold that it seemed I could hear my heartbeat. Everyone looked at me, waiting. Gaston continued to smile his pitiful, hopeful smile. I took a deep breath, trying not to lose my temper, and said, "I don't want anyone else living in my house." My mother's face fell, and she immediately tried to object. "Alda, it's not anyone. It's your brother and his wife." I nodded and replied, "I understand, but my answer remains no." And then Sarah decided to intervene. She jerked her head up and muttered through clenched teeth, "I always knew you were greedy and arrogant." I looked her straight in the eye and said coldly, "It's funny, because I remember well how at my housewarming party you declared you didn't want to come to my pigsty, and now it seems you're quite willing to live there." Sarah shrugged dismissively. "Well, if it's free, I guess I can manage somehow." Her audacity was simply astounding. Gaston immediately chimed in, adopting his pitiful tone. "Alda, you see, there are layoffs at work. My salary was cut by 20%. Things are really tough for us right now." I looked from him to Sarah and said, "Maybe Sarah should get a job instead of wasting her days on her toy blogs." Sarah's face flushed and she hissed, "How dare you?" But I didn't stop. I'm simply stating a fact. If money is tight, maybe both adults in the family should work. At this point, Sarah completely lost it. Her face twisted, tears streamed down her cheeks, and she burst into dramatic sobs, storming out of the dining room and stomping up the stairs to my former bedroom, where my posters had once hung and where she had now apparently decided to stage a scene of great sacrifice. "Look what you've done!" Gaston shouted, jumping up from his chair. "You're such a fool, Alda," he added, running after his wife. My parents remained seated at the table, silent, looking as if they were facing the worst daughter in the world, and that silence was worse than any words. I finished my dinner hastily without looking up and left, feeling a heavy lump in my stomach. After that evening, there was silence, and I mean complete silence. No calls, no messages, no invitations. It was as if I'd been erased from the family, as if I'd ceased to exist. A whole month passed. Not a single Saturday dinner, not a single random text from Gaston, no attempt to mend the rift. And frankly, I felt not only pain but also relief, because I no longer had to contend with the guilt of not allowing Gaston and Sarah to move into my house. I had my own life again, quiet and calm, filled with chores, projects, and get-togethers with friends. My home finally became my sanctuary, a place where I could breathe freely. I hosted guests, hosted dinners, and tackled small landscaping projects, all without the fear of someone showing up at any moment and making snide comments about my choices. But one Tuesday, everything changed. I had a meeting scheduled with a new potential client for 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The project promised to be large-scale and lucrative, and I was preparing for it with the utmost seriousness. However, around 11:30, the client called and apologized, saying she had to reschedule due to a family emergency. I calmly replied that it was no big deal and decided to use the free time to work on paperwork. But then I remembered I'd left several important files at home, and without a second thought, I decided to go back there and spend the rest of the day working in my own office. I returned home around noon, almost 3 hours earlier than usual on a Tuesday, which in itself seemed odd, as I had a routine I rarely broke. As I approached the house, I immediately noticed 2 cars parked outside, and my heart sank when I recognized them. One belonged to my parents, the other to Gaston. My first thought pierced me like a cold needle. Something had happened, something serious. Maybe they'd been trying to call and I hadn't heard, and now they'd come here in desperation. But a moment later, I realized that if there had been a real emergency, they would certainly have called. They would have found a way to warn me. I opened the door with my key, and as soon as I stepped through the door, my stomach sank. Something abnormal was clearly happening in the house. My things were scattered everywhere, as if someone had turned my life inside out and put it on display. The furniture from my master bedroom, the dresser, the nightstands, even the bedside lamps, had been dragged into the living room and hallway, and I stood amidst the chaos, unable to believe my eyes. Voices drifted upstairs, loud and energetic, as if someone was working furiously, and my heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. I began climbing the stairs, the tension growing with each step, and when I reached my bedroom and saw the door wide open, my legs buckled beneath me. I entered and froze. My parents were there, Gaston, and of course, Sarah, who stood in the middle of my bedroom with a satisfied, almost triumphant smile. Besides them, there were 2 unfamiliar men with brushes and rollers, and I realized they were repainting my walls, the very same ones I'd spent weeks choosing, searching for the perfect shade of gray. And now, instead of that noble gray, my walls were covered with a disgusting, bright, acid pink color, reminiscent of a cheap heartburn medicine. "What the hell is going on here?" I screamed, my voice shaking. Everyone turned to look at me. The workers froze with their rollers. My parents looked guilty. Gaston stood like a deer in headlights, but Sarah continued to flash that nasty smile. "Oh, great, there you are," she said calmly, as if it were a matter of course. "We've decided to give the master bedroom a little makeover before Gaston and I move in." "Do you like the color?" I was so angry I could barely speak. "Stop!" I yelled at the workers. "Stop painting my walls this instant!" They looked at each other, unsure what to do, but eventually obeyed and put down their brushes. I turned sharply to my mother. "What does this mean? How did you get in here?" And then Mom dared to smile and quietly reply, "I used my key, dear." We're family, after all. We knew you wanted Gaston and Sarah to be comfortable when they moved in. Move! I felt my voice break. "I told you clearly no. I've said it more than once," Dad interjected in his calm, seemingly unwavering voice. "We knew that sooner or later you'd understand that the right thing to do was to do the family thing." I almost screamed, "Right?" "The right thing is to invade my house, turn my bedroom inside out, and turn it into a circus." I pointed at the door. "Get out of here immediately or I'll call the police." Mom and Dad began scolding me, accusing me of being selfish, of not understanding the meaning of family loyalty. Gaston, blushing, shouted that I didn't want to understand his problems and that I was obligated to help him. Sarah, clutching her hands to her chest, added sarcastically, "You're selfish and ungrateful, always have been." The workers were smarter. They quickly gathered their tools and left, realizing they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. "I'm serious," I said icily as the door slammed behind them. "Everyone leave right now, or I'll escort you out of here myself." They looked at me as if I were crazy, but there was something in my voice that convinced them of my resolve. One by one, they filed out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the house. I was left standing alone in the middle of my ruined bedroom. Half the walls were still my favorite gray, while the other half glowed a bright pink that made my stomach churn. I was shaking with anger, but I knew there was no time to waste, or they'd try something else. I pulled out my phone and called Mike, a handyman I'd worked with for a long time and trusted. "Mike, I need you to come right now and change the locks on all the doors. This is urgent, an emergency," I said, and he immediately promised he'd come. While I waited for him, I went to the store and bought several cans of the same paint I'd been choosing for the bedroom. Mike arrived quickly, and I watched him change the locks one by one, on the front door, the back door, even the garage. When he left, I took a deep breath. Now they no longer had the keys to my house. That same evening, I picked up brushes and rollers and painted until late into the night, painting over the pink horror, restoring the walls to their former, calm and noble hue. I was exhausted. My hands were shaking. My eyes were stung by the paint. But I felt I had to erase everything they'd done, otherwise I wouldn't be able to sleep peacefully. When I finally finished around 2 in the morning, my bedroom had regained the appearance I'd worked so hard to create, and although the walls glowed their former calm gray, I was too nervous and exhausted to sleep there. So I moved my pillow and blanket to the guest room, where at least their pink insolence wouldn't be felt. In the morning, I called a couple more of my trusted friends to help me move the furniture back into place, because I no longer had the strength to handle this arduous task myself. Once everything was back to normal, I finally did what I should have done months ago, when I first felt my boundaries being overstepped. I called a security company and, without hesitation, declared that I wanted perimeter cameras, an alarm, motion, and door sensors, the whole package, so that no presumptuous soul would ever think of disturbing my peace again. They arrived that same day, as if they sensed my urgency, and I watched with relief as the technicians installed cameras on every corner, sensors on windows and doors, and connected the entire system to an app on my phone, allowing me to see and control everything even when I was far from home. For the first time in a long time, I breathed a sigh of relief. My home was now protected, the locks were securely replaced, and if anyone ever tried to break in again, I would have irrefutable proof. I immediately felt like this was the best investment of my life, and fate proved me right faster than I expected. Just a couple of days after the installation, I was sitting at my desk, brainstorming ideas for a new project, when suddenly my phone began shaking with incessant notifications. The security app was sending alarm after alarm. Motion detected. Intrusion attempt through the main entrance. Alarm triggered. My heart sank. I turned on the live feed with trembling fingers and almost dropped my phone. Gaston was standing right outside my door, a key gleaming in his hand, and I recognized it. It was the same spare I'd once naively given to my mother. I watched him try to insert it into the lock, turning it back and forth, growing increasingly angry, and finally glancing around as if afraid the neighbors would catch him. He headed for the car, returned, and a crowbar appeared in his hands. I couldn't believe my eyes. My own brother, the man with whom I once shared childhood secrets, was now trying to break into my house by force. He jammed a crowbar into the doorframe and began tugging, applying increasing force. But at that moment, a siren blared. The lights on the security camera flickered, and he, frozen, darted his gaze around, dropped the crowbar right by the threshold, and, as if being chased, raced to the car and disappeared. I sat at the table staring at my phone, unable to believe this wasn't a dream. Yes, I knew our relationship had deteriorated, but I couldn't bear the thought of him stooping to real crime. I saved the recording and immediately went to the police station. "I want to file a report for attempted burglary and illegal entry," I told the officer on duty and showed him the video. The officers' faces grew serious. They immediately realized there was nothing to argue about. The recording clearly showed Gaston holding the key, then the crowbar, and his desperate attempts to pry the door open. I filed a report, attached all the documents, and was told they would contact me about the next steps. Returning home, I felt a strange mixture. On the one hand, confidence that I had done the right thing, and on the other, bitterness, because it was my brother, the man I had once loved unconditionally. But a line had been crossed, and there was no turning back. On Saturday evening, my phone rang. I picked it up, and before I could even say hello, I heard my mother's hysterical scream in my ear. "Alda, what have you done?" "The police came and arrested Gaston. They said you claimed he tried to break into your house." I closed my eyes and calmly replied, "He did try. I have video evidence." But my mother seemed not to hear me. "You need to go and drop the charges right now." "We're talking about your brother," I said coldly. Maybe my brother shouldn't have tried to break into my house with a crowbar. Sobs and complaints came over the phone. She was crying and wailing about how I was ruining the family, how I was ruining my brother, how ruthless I was. I listened to her and felt like something final was being decided. Then I said, "I'll drop the charges. But only on one condition. You all leave me alone. Never show up at my house again. No attempts to force me to let them live with me. No persuasion, no scenes, no drama. You're leaving me completely alone." There was a short pause on the other end, and then I heard her hurried, desperate. Yes, whatever you want, just please do it. Please drop the charges." After I hung up, the phone literally exploded with calls, and at first I didn't even understand who this wave was chasing. Dad, Gaston, Sarah, everyone was calling and texting, begging me to drop the charges, promising they'd never bother me again if I just go back to the station and withdraw my statement. The messages were full of pleading. "Please, Alda, we swear we'll leave you alone. Just withdraw. We've screwed up. Help us." And each new message crushed my heart, but also left me with a strange numbness, because I'd already seen where our relationship had gone all these turbulent months. I left them to sweat it out overnight, giving myself time to think. But in the morning, I went back to the police and formally withdrew my complaint, a gesture that was both conciliatory and bordering on despair, because Gaston was released that same day. He had no criminal record. He had been questioned and warned, and that, apparently, was enough to frighten him to the core and change his behavior. After that incident, it was as if the wind had blown. No one called anymore. No one showed up unannounced. All the messages ceased. And I confess, I felt relief mingled with a certain bitter awkwardness. 6 months passed in peace and quiet. in which I learned to breathe my own way again, knowing I could go away for the weekend and return home without fear of finding the walls repainted in someone else's taste. One day at the grocery store, I ran into my cousin Lisa. We'd always been close but hadn't spoken since all this mess started. She hugged me and asked how I was, then casually mentioned that she'd heard Gaston and Sarah were now living with my parents and that Sarah seemed pregnant, and in that moment many pieces of the puzzle became clear. Financial difficulties, layoffs at work, the oncoming baby. That's why they were so insistent on asking for help. Lisa pitied them, said that their parents would probably be happy to help, and I just nodded, not going into details, because I felt it was no longer my responsibility to decide their fates. On the way home, the anxiety subsided slightly, and in its place came pure relief. It wasn't my problem to solve. I knew, and therein lay a quiet pride, that I had done the right thing by buying the house, renovating it to my taste, and refusing to allow it to be converted into a part-time home for those who believed family ties gave them the right to intrude. I had returned to my normal life, loved evenings in my rooms, was proud of my work, and reveled in the fact that no one would ever think of overstepping my boundaries. Some would call me selfish or mean. Some would say I had betrayed my family's feelings, but I was tired of making excuses. I had worked and built my own space, and I had every right to protect what was dear to me. My family had made their choice, I had made mine, and I was not obligated to pay for their mistakes. I had defended my home from people who thought they could walk all over me, and if necessary, I would do it again, without hesitation or doubt. Sometimes you have to choose yourself, even when it's hard, even when others call you selfish, even if it means losing relationships you thought were important. Because in the end, it's our decisions that shape our tomorrow.